On New Year's Eve, my daughter brushed past me, her hand firm on the door, her voice colder than the winter outside. "Don't embarrass yourself tonight. Just sit quietly. Nobody came here for you." Those words cut deeper than the wind that had followed me up the steps. The house glowed with warmth, laughter spilling through the hallways, yet I entered not as family, not as host, not even as guest, only as a shadow tolerated at the edge of celebration. My coat was still damp from the night air when I stepped inside, but what chilled me most was not the weather. It was the way eyes glanced through me, as if I were made of glass. Chairs were filled with joy and movement. Voices rose in cheer and clinking glasses, but none paused for me. Not one smile turned my way. I walked slowly, the sound of my footsteps lost beneath their laughter, and I found a place at the far end, at a corner table half lit by a lamp whose bulb flickered, as though even the light refused to rest upon me. The seat was hard, cold, and yet it felt kinder than the people who should have welcomed me. I placed my hands on the table, folded them together, and reminded myself to breathe. The conversations swirled like rivers I no longer belonged to. They spoke of their work, their travels, the houses they bought, the deals they struck, the bright futures they boasted of. But when my name lingered at the edge of their stories, it was brushed away like dust. I was not present in their words. I was not present in their pride. And yet, I was there, breathing, watching, hearing every slight. Even the smallest gestures marked the truth of the evening. Glasses of wine passed from hand to hand, plates filled and refilled, but when the dishes reached me, they skipped past without pause. My daughter's hand brushed the air between us as if to remind me. Silent, unseen, forgotten. Across the table, my grandson laughed, pointing at a story on his phone, and whispered to his cousin, he wouldn't understand any of this. Their laughter bled into the chatter, careless, cruel, but deliberate. I sat without protest, my chest rising slowly, forcing calm into my lungs. I had not come for food. I had not come for warmth. I had not even come for kindness, though some small part of me, weary and human, had hoped for it. No, I came for something else, something they had long denied me, but which the world could no longer hide. And as I sat there, quiet in my corner, I knew the night would not end as it began, for the walls that ignored me would soon echo with my voice, though I would never have to speak a word. Friends, let's pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever felt something like this in your own life? The chair beside me stayed empty, untouched, as though even wood and fabric had conspired to echo my invisibility. In a hall where every place was claimed, where laughter spilled across the long table like wine, mine remained deserted, a silent monument to absence. Guests leaned toward one another, their voices weaving webs of closeness, but no one leaned toward me. It was as if the air itself built a wall around my seat, sealing me off from the warmth of belonging. Plates moved from hand to eager hand. Glasses lifted, clinked, refilled. Yet always, when the flow of generosity reached my corner, it broke. A platter turned, redirected. A glass passed around me without pause. I sat with empty hands while others reached for more. And though hunger tugged faintly at me, it was not the food I longed for. It was the acknowledgement of being seen, the simple grace of being remembered. At moments I caught the flicker of glances, not of care, but of calculation, as though my presence were a burden that must be tolerated. Some avoided my eyes altogether, as though meeting them would summon guilt too heavy to bear. My daughter's shoulders tightened whenever I shifted in my chair. My grandson's laughter grew louder whenever I grew still, as though to drown out the weight of my silence. The hall brimmed with life, yet around me was a pocket of emptiness no one dared to enter. The emptiness pressed harder than any insult, for it was not spoken cruelty, but the refusal to speak at all. It was the quiet erasure of a man who had given so much, now treated as though he were an echo of the past. The chair beside me became a mirror, reflecting not my presence, but the hollow way they saw me, unnecessary, dispensable, forgotten. I sat without moving, though the weight of that empty seat cut deeper than any harsh word, for in its vacancy I saw the truth. They had already written me out of their lives, and yet, though ignored, I knew the silence would not hold forever. Something greater stirred just beyond their laughter, waiting to speak in a voice louder than theirs, a voice they could not silence or bend. The first whisper reached me like a blade carried on laughter. It was not shouted, not meant for confrontation, but slipped like poison between clinking glasses. "He's outdated." A casual remark, tossed lightly, yet heavy enough to crush. Another voice followed, just as careless. "He has nothing left to offer." The words fell into the air like ash, settling on me while the rest of the table carried on, unbothered. Their laughter was not loud, not cruel in sound, but in its indifference. It cut sharper than fury ever could. I lowered my eyes, not from guilt, but from weariness, swallowing the silence that weighed heavier than any food I had been denied. Every line of my face burned with the knowledge that my years, my sacrifices, the decades I had given, were now treated as relics, dusty, irrelevant, unwanted. To them, I was a story they no longer cared to read, a figure blurred into the background of their brighter, louder lives. My hands, calloused from work once honored, lay still on the table, the veins rising beneath the skin like maps of roads long traveled but now forgotten by those who had walked them with me. My heart ached, not for recognition in this moment, but for the truth that those who bore my name found it so easy to erase the weight of what I had been. The whispers grew, scattered among conversations, never meant for my ears but sharpened by the very certainty that I would not respond. That was their mistake. They believed my silence was weakness, when in truth it was the quiet restraint of a man who had endured far worse storms. They mistook patience for frailty, dignity for emptiness. I pressed my lips together and let the noise wash over me. But inside, every word settled into memory, not as wounds, but as seeds. Seeds that would bloom not in anger, but in justice. For though they laughed now, though they dismissed and excluded, the night had not yet revealed its full shape, and soon the whispers that mocked me would be silenced by a voice they could not ignore, my own, carried on the currents of truth, waiting just beyond the glow of the screen. Stories began to ripple around the table like waves, each one swelling with pride, polished with self-importance. They spoke of journeys abroad, of meetings in high towers, of contracts signed and deals struck as if the world bent to their ambition. Laughter rose and fell with each tale, glasses lifted in recognition, applause scattered like coins across their words. But in all the boasting and all the noise, not once did my name surface. Not once did a memory of me enter their stories. It was as though I had never existed, as though the years I had poured into their foundations had been quietly erased. My sacrifices folded away, tucked into the margins like a napkin no one cared to use. The irony cut deep, for it was this very table, this very hall, this very family gathering that had once stood on the strength of my labor, my vision, my sacrifices. Yet tonight, they built their pride on the illusion that I had no place in their story. I watched them lean forward, eyes shining as they shared their victories, hands gesturing wide as if to carve their names into the air. They measured one another in wealth and success, competing for admiration. But I, who had given them the very ground they stood on, was nothing more than an echo fading in the corner. My presence was tolerated, but my history denied. The wound of exclusion was not in their words, but in their silence. To be unseen, to be unspoken, to be erased. This was the betrayal that hollowed deeper than any insult. I could have endured their mockery. I could have forgiven their careless whispers, but to be omitted entirely, as though I had never mattered, was a cruelty I could not name. I sat still, my silence heavier than the clamor of their voices. Every story they told pressed against me, not as envy, but as a reminder of the distance they had chosen. They no longer looked to me for wisdom, no longer credited the hands that had built their path. And yet, though they had cast me aside, I felt no urge to rise or speak, for I knew what they did not, that truth had a way of returning, louder than any boasting, undeniable as the turning of years, and when it came, it would not need my defense. It would carry my name where their silence refused to place it. The smiles cut deeper than words ever could. My grandson's smirk, sharp and careless, was the first blade. He waved his phone in the air, showing some new deal, some bright digital victory, and with a chuckle that tried to sound innocent, he muttered, "Grandpa wouldn't understand." The table erupted with light laughter, shallow but loud enough to sting. They did not mean to wound, or perhaps they did. Either way, the scar formed instantly. Then came the whisper, quieter, more deliberate, carried from lips close enough to burn. My daughter-in-law leaned toward another, her eyes sliding in my direction, and with a smile sweet enough to poison, she said, "Just let him sit quietly." That smile was not kindness. It was dismissal dressed in politeness, a mask painted to cover cruelty. Around her, heads nodded, as though this were a sensible truth. Let him sit. Let him fade. Let him be unseen. Those smiles stung worse than open insults because they pretended to be harmless. They cloaked humiliation in civility, erasure in courtesy, and yet their eyes betrayed them, the quick glances, the curve of lips pulled too tightly, the laughter too quick to hide the intent. They believed they were sparing me, sparing themselves, sparing the room from my irrelevance. In truth, they were chiseling away the last remnants of connection, cutting me out of the family portrait while pretending to adjust the frame. I looked down at my hands, hands that once held their futures, hands that once built the life they now celebrated without me. Wrinkles traced years of labor, veins mapped sacrifices they would never know. To them, those hands were nothing but old skin, shaking with time. They did not see the bridges those hands had built, the doors they had opened, the futures they had carved. The room filled again with chatter, laughter ricocheting from wall to wall, but for me it all dimmed, muted beneath the weight of their mockery. Each smile, each glance, each careless dismissal pressed against me like stones, and yet, in their eagerness to bury me beneath silence and laughter, they had forgotten one truth. A man erased from their table could not be erased from the world. For outside these walls, beyond their shallow judgment, my voice had already been carried farther than their pride could reach. They did not know it yet, but the night would betray their cruelty with a light brighter than their smiles, and a truth sharper than their whispers. In the corner of the hall, half hidden behind garlands and forgotten decorations, a large television flickered softly, its glow a faint pulse against the chatter of the room. The news played without sound, images shifting across the screen while no one bothered to look. Their laughter drowned it out. Their boasting smothered its presence, but my eyes kept returning to it, as though the light itself called to me. It was the only thing in that hall that seemed to notice I was there, the only companion that did not turn away. The glow brushed against the glasses on the table, glinting faintly across silverware, and for a moment it looked as if the light reached only me, painting my hands in a pale reflection. Around me, stories of wealth and triumph cascaded endlessly, their voices weaving tighter circles that excluded me entirely, but I no longer tried to force my way into them. My attention belonged to that flickering corner, to the silent promise it carried. It was as if the screen itself waited, patient, biding its time until the world beyond these walls would demand to be heard. No one else noticed. My daughter spoke louder, eager to keep the spotlight. My grandson scrolled through his phone, his smirk, never far away. They thought they owned the night, thought their laughter was the only story worth telling. But the television glowed on, its light steady, unyielding, almost prophetic. I sat still, my chest heavy, my silence sharp as glass. The more they ignored me, the stronger the pull of that screen became. It was a reminder that truth cannot be hidden forever, that dignity does not vanish simply because pride refuses to acknowledge it. Though they tried to erase me, though they brushed me aside as irrelevant, something greater stirred within that quiet glow. The laughter continued, careless and triumphant. But I did not hear it anymore. I heard only the rhythm of my own breath, the hum of electricity, the unspoken promise that the world outside these walls still knew my name. The screen was waiting, and so was I. I stayed in my corner, patient, my hands folded on the table as though I were praying for something long lost. Every second pressed heavier on my chest, each tick of the clock another reminder that I was not meant to belong here anymore. Their laughter rose and fell, their stories spun circles of pride and vanity, but none reached me. The weight of exclusion grew unbearable, not because I hungered for their food or their cheer, but because I had come to search for one thing alone: respect, a place at the table that was more than wood and glass, a place in their memory, in their hearts. But the truth stared back at me with the coldness of the empty chair beside mine. Respect no longer lived in this house. It had been evicted quietly, its door slammed shut, just as mine had been in their voices and their eyes. What remained was hollow courtesy, a tolerance that cut deeper than cruelty, a pretense of family without the soul of it. I felt like a shadow stretched across their celebration, present but unseen, a weight they carried unwillingly. I listened, waiting for a moment, a glance, a word that might acknowledge me, not as a burden, not as a relic, but as the man who had built the ground beneath their comfort. Yet nothing came. My son avoided my gaze, my daughter busied herself with glasses, my grandchildren drowned in their glowing screens. They had carved a world where I no longer existed, and they celebrated their triumph in my silence. I remained still, but inside the silence grew heavy, echoing louder than their joy. I had not come here to fight, nor to demand gratitude. I had come with a quiet hope that perhaps, somewhere in their voices, my name would still mean something. But as I sat among them, invisible in the house I had helped create, I understood the truth. To them, I was already gone. And yet, even as that realization sank like stone into my heart, I felt no urge to rise, no urge to flee. Something deeper held me there, something patient, something certain. They could erase me from their table, from their stories, from their pride, but they could not erase the truth waiting in the shadows with me. For the night was not finished. And though they did not know it, respect was about to return. Not from them, but from a voice greater than theirs. A voice that would make them see what they had tried so hard to deny. The storm rose quietly within me, not in rage or shouting, but in the weight of memory pressing against the silence they forced upon me. I remembered the years when my voice filled halls brighter than this one, when students leaned forward to catch every word of a lecture that shaped their futures. I remembered the projects I built with hands now wrinkled, structures that still stood in the city like unspoken monuments, testimonies of labor and sacrifice. I remembered the voices I once guided, young, uncertain, searching, and how those voices grew steady because of me. All of it, entire decades of work and devotion, now erased as though a single evening of arrogance could undo a lifetime. The storm churned inside, fierce and bitter, but I did not let it spill. My dignity restrained me, holding me steady in the shadows. To rise, to shout, to remind them of who I was would have been too easy, too small. Fury would have made me equal to their cruelty. No, my silence was heavier, my stillness stronger. They mistook it for weakness, but it was a restraint born of discipline, a power they could never understand. Every laugh at the table was a spark against dry wood, tempting the blaze to break loose, but I kept it contained. I lifted my eyes only once, letting them rest on the faces of those who had once depended on me, who had once drawn warmth from my work, wisdom from my voice. Now they turned away, blinded by the glare of their own pride. My silence became my shield, my crown, my protest that needed no sound. The storm within me grew, not to destroy them, but to remind me that truth cannot be buried forever. I did not need their recognition, their fleeting applause, or their shallow words. I had lived long enough to know that respect built on arrogance collapses, while respect earned through sacrifice endures. So I sat still, the storm locked deep in my chest, my dignity guarding it like a fortress. They believed they had erased me, but they could not erase the years I carried inside me, and soon the truth would rise louder than their laughter, not from my lips, but from a place they could not silence, a place they could not escape. The moment came quietly, almost by accident, like a candle flickering in a storm. The room was still roaring with chatter, glasses clinking, forks scraping, laughter spilling without pause, when a voice rose above it all. Not mine, not anyone at the table, but the steady, commanding tone of the news anchor. At first, no one noticed, their pride too loud, their conversations too self-absorbed. Heads turned lazily, distracted, half-interested, as if the world outside their circle could offer nothing greater than the echo of their own voices. And then the headline appeared, sharp and undeniable, marching across the bottom of the glowing screen. Interview with the city's mentor and builder of tomorrow. For a heartbeat, the words lingered like a shadow on the wall, and before the laughter could swallow them, my picture filled the screen. My face, weathered, lined by years, but steady, proud, alive, lit the hall brighter than the decorations strung along the walls. The air changed. Forks froze mid-air, glasses halted before lips. Conversation broke apart, scattered like glass, dropped on stone. Their laughter choked into silence, not because they wanted to honor me, but because they could no longer pretend not to see me. My picture filled every eye, commanding attention they had refused to give, forcing recognition where they had offered none. It was not me who demanded it. It was the world. It was the city. It was truth, carried on the voice of someone far beyond these walls. All their whispers, outdated, irrelevant, forgotten, collapsed in an instant under the weight of what now stared back at them. I was no longer the quiet shadow at the end of the table. I was the man on the screen, the man they could not erase, the man whose name and work lived far beyond their arrogance. I did not move. I did not smile. I simply watched as their eyes shifted, as pride drained into confusion, as the weight of truth began pressing against their carefully built walls of denial. For the first time that night, the silence belonged to me. The screen had spoken, and no one dared to laugh. The hall froze as though time itself had been struck silent. Forks hovered in the air, trembling in suspended hands. Glasses stopped mid-lift, and even the shallow hum of background chatter vanished into nothing. My image on the screen glowed brighter than every candle and every string of light in the room, and for the first time that evening, not one eye could look away. The man they had ignored, the one left to fade in the shadows of the corner, now commanded the center of the hall without ever leaving his seat. It was not pride that filled me, but a strange, aching stillness, as if the silence itself were heavy enough to crush. They had spent the night building a world where I did not exist, and now that illusion shattered in an instant, pieces falling noiselessly around them. Their arrogance dissolved, their laughter choked back, and in the hollow quiet that followed, the truth rang louder than anything they had spoken. I saw it in their faces. The grandson's smirk drained into disbelief, his phone forgotten in his palm. My daughter's shoulders stiffened, her glass quivering in her hand. The daughter-in-law's lips parted, the whisper she meant to deliver dying on her tongue. They tried not to look at me, but the screen forced them to. It was no longer my choice. The truth had been placed before them by voices greater than theirs, and there was no refuge from its weight. I did not move, did not claim victory, did not even lift my head high. I sat as I had sat all night, quiet and still, the very same man they dismissed. Yet now the air shifted around me, thick with the shame they could not speak. My silence had not changed, but its meaning had. Where once they saw frailty, they now saw restraint. Where once they saw irrelevance, they now saw dignity. The silence shattered everything they had built that evening, the mockery, the whispers, the erasure. And in its ruins stood only the truth, that respect cannot be hidden, that legacy cannot be erased, and that no matter how deep they buried me, my name rose higher than their laughter ever could. My voice entered the room not from my lips but from the screen, carried by the calm authority of the recording. It was steady, measured, unshaken, each word flowing with the weight of years lived, of battles fought in silence, of victories that needed no applause. The same voice they had dismissed, ignored, and silenced at their table now filled the entire hall, reaching every ear, forcing every heart to listen. I spoke not of myself and glory, but of sacrifice, of the countless hours poured into shaping futures that did not belong to me, of lessons given freely to those who needed guidance, of nights spent building when no one else would lift a hand. I spoke of the bridges raised, the students inspired, the generations taught to believe in more than themselves. I spoke of values too often forgotten, integrity, perseverance, the dignity of honest work. My words did not need bitterness. They carried something sharper, something heavier, the undeniable truth. Each sentence struck like steel, cutting not to wound but to reveal, and with every line the hall grew tighter, quieter, as though the very walls leaned in to hear what they had so long refused to acknowledge. My daughter lowered her head, unable to meet the eyes of the man she had silenced at the door. My grandson shifted in his chair, restless, the smirk long gone from his lips. My son's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles pale, his pride collapsing under the weight of a father's voice he had tried to bury. There was no anger in the words, no demand for repayment, no gloating hidden between the lines. That was what unsettled them most. Revenge would have been easier for them to dismiss, fury easier to explain away. But dignity, calm, unwavering dignity, left no escape. The recording reminded them that legacy is not carried in shouts, but in truth, spoken with quiet conviction. I sat still as my own voice echoed through the hall, my heart heavy yet unbroken. They had tried to silence me, to render me invisible, to erase me with whispers and smiles. Yet here I was, not by force, not by pleading, but by truth carried on airwaves larger than their pride. The voice they denied had returned to them, undeniable, unerasable, and it spoke louder than their laughter ever could. Their laughter dissolved as if it had never belonged to the room. What only moments ago had been a storm of voices and pride collapsed into a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Faces drained of their false cheer. Some turned pale, stricken by the sudden weight of shame, while others flushed red, burning with the humiliation of being unmasked. The arrogance that had carried the night shriveled under the glow of the screen, fragile and brittle now that truth had entered the hall. My grandson, who had smirked and mocked with careless words, lowered his eyes, his phone slipping quietly onto the table, forgotten. The bravado that had filled his young voice fled from him, leaving only the tremor of guilt that he could not swallow. My daughter-in-law, so quick to whisper dismissal, pressed her lips together, trembling as though the screen itself judged her cruelty. Her hands fidgeted, clutching at the stem of her glass, as if holding on to something fragile might steady her unraveling pride. My son stared rigidly ahead, his face locked in a struggle between anger and recognition, torn between clinging to his own pride and surrendering to the undeniable truth. The man he had pushed aside, silenced, treated as an afterthought, now stood larger than him, not in flesh but in honor, and the more he tried to steady himself, the more the cracks showed, his arrogance crumbling in silence. They had built this evening on mockery, on erasure, on the belief that their pride was stronger than my presence. But pride built on lies cannot survive the weight of truth, and truth had arrived, carried not by my hand, but by the world outside their walls. A world that refused to forget me. No denial, no laughter, no forced smile could protect them now. The collapse was not loud. It was quiet, almost fragile. But in that stillness, their shame spoke louder than words ever could. Every bowed head, every averted eye, every trembling hand was an admission. They had thought me erased, thought me irrelevant, thought me gone. But now, exposed before the very walls they filled with laughter, they faced the truth they could no longer bury, that the man they ignored was the very man who had carried them to where they stood. Their arrogance had fallen, and in its ruins only my dignity remained. No one touched their plates now. Forks lay abandoned beside half-eaten food. Glasses remained untouched, though wine still glistened within them. The air was thick, too heavy for appetite, too suffocating for cheer. Their laughter, once so eager, had been smothered by the sound of my name spoken with reverence from the screen. Every syllable praised not the man they had dismissed, but the truth they had buried, the years of sacrifice they had mocked, the honor they had denied. I watched their eyes, each one a mirror of shame. My grandson stared into his lap, his hands clenched, his face stripped of every trace of arrogance. The boy who once thought me irrelevant now sat small, crushed beneath the weight of a name he could not ignore. My daughter-in-law's smile, so quick and cutting before, was gone. Her lips pressed thin, her hands restless, her eyes darting as if to escape the very sound of the praise filling the hall. Even my daughter, who had brushed past me at the door, seemed shrunken now, her posture stiff, her gaze lowered, the sting of guilt rising in her cheeks. The anchor's words continued, calm but unyielding. Mentor, builder, guide, legacy. They rolled through the room like a tide, leaving no space for denial. Each title, each honor, each recognition bound them tighter to their shame. They could not protest, could not excuse, could not laugh it away. They were trapped in the truth, cornered by the very dignity they had tried to erase. I did not gloat, did not move, did not meet their shame with anger. I simply remained still, my silence the loudest voice at the table. The man they had erased sat before them, and yet they could not look me in the eye, for in my silence, in the calm dignity of my stillness, they saw everything they had failed to honor. Their shame was not born of my revenge, but of their reflection, forced to see themselves against the truth of who I had always been. The hall was no longer theirs. It belonged to the voice on the screen, to the truth they could not silence, to the honor they could not deny. And as they shifted uncomfortably, struggling to swallow their pride, I felt the balance of the night shift. I had come searching for respect, and though it had not been given by their hands, It had been placed before them in a way they could never escape. Their shame was proof enough. They finally saw me, not as the man in the shadows, but as the man whose name outlived their arrogance. I did not rise. I did not move to seize the moment, nor did I let triumph twist my lips into a smile. I sat as I had all night, still and quiet, my hands folded gently before me. Around me, their shame thickened, their silence echoing in a hall once swollen with laughter. Yet I offered no words of reproach, no accusations, no reminders of their cruelty. There was no need. The glow of the screen spoke more powerfully than I ever could, each flicker of light carving truth into their hearts more deeply than anger ever would. My silence thundered louder than any speech, filling the space where pride once lived, leaving them no refuge. They waited, perhaps, for me to gloat, to wield their shame like a weapon, but I had no desire for vengeance. Revenge is loud, fleeting, dignity is eternal, and tonight, dignity belonged to me. They had stripped me of place, of honor, of acknowledgement, but the world had returned it, not through my demand, but through its own recognition. The screen glowed steadily, my voice replaying in calm cadence, my face lit with the dignity they had failed to see. Every word reminded them of the years they had dismissed. Every image of me reminded them of the man they had tried to reduce to nothing, and I needed to do nothing more than sit there, patient, unshaken, a man who did not need to defend himself because the truth had already stood up in his place. In their eyes I saw the war between pride and regret, the slow breaking of the walls they had built against me. And still I remained silent, for silence now was not weakness, but strength, not emptiness, but authority. The world itself had spoken for me. Justice had arrived, not with fury, but with light. And there, in that hall where I had been invisible, I became undeniable, without ever raising my voice. Years later, when the story of that evening was told, no one spoke of the feast laid on the table, the glittering glasses, or the laughter that once tried to fill the room. Those details had dissolved into dust, unworthy of memory. What remained, what endured, was the moment the screen came alive, flooding the hall with light and truth. They remembered the man who had sat silently in the corner, ignored, belittled, erased, and how in a single breath he became the man whose presence could no longer be denied. That image stayed carved into memory, brighter than any candle they lit that night, heavier than any toast they raised. Children who had once smirked with arrogance grew into adults who could not retell the night without lowering their eyes. Sons and daughters who had brushed him aside found their voices tremble when they spoke his name, a name they had once tried to silence, but which time had carved into stone. And even those who were not there, the younger generations who heard the story passed down, did not ask what meal was eaten or what jokes were told. They asked only about the man who sat quietly, who said nothing, yet whose name filled the room, louder than their laughter. His legacy did not belong to inheritance, nor to the frail bonds of blood that had sought to erase him. It lived in the work that outlasted him, in the students who rose because of his guidance, in the projects that stood firm as monuments to his labor. It lived in the dignity of his silence, in the calm strength of a man who needed no revenge, no fury, no fight, only the truth, revealed in its own time, on its own stage. His name became a lesson, a weight, a warning, that arrogance can blind, but it cannot erase, that respect is not demanded by age, nor gifted by family, it is earned, and once earned, it outshines everything that seeks to bury it. When they remembered him, they no longer spoke of an old man pushed to the corner of the table. They remembered the patriarch, the mentor, the builder whose life had shaped more than walls, whose dignity had outlasted betrayal. His name was not just remembered, it was carried forward, undeniable, unerasable, shining like a light in the memory of those who had once tried to dim it. And though they had failed him in life, in the retelling of that night, in the silence that still haunts them, his legacy grew stronger. For in the end, it was not their laughter that endured, it was his name, spoken with reverence, standing taller than the arrogance that once sought to bury him.